Today we are back at the Staffordshire Regimental Museum to do some further exploring of the history here, presented here at the museum, seeing world events through the eyes of the regiment. Welcome back to the programme, and if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself for any of the viewers who haven't seen our previous video.
Hello there, my name is Peter Collins and I'm Museum Director at the Staffordshire Regiment Museum. I'm here to talk to you with the Ducky Detectives about the Second World War.
Thank you very much. So, one thing is, I noticed that we have this place called Smart Street, and this being a regimental museum but covering the home front. So, if you don't mind me asking, why in a military themed museum is there a section on the civilian life of the Second World War?
That's a very good question. As many people know, the Second World War has been fought on what we call the war front, but it's also fought on the home front. And it's very important to keep your populace happy and protected, so they were making the equipment that you needed for war, and that they were content and happy and not causing strife and things at home. So the home front is very much part of the story of the Second World War. And here at the museum we've created some part of the home front as part of our education activities about the museum. We also have a little bit related to the war, and that part of it covers the stop lines, so of course involved to stop German invasion during the Second World War. But let's say from our point of view, it is equally important to talk about the home front as well as the war front.
So, as we see behind you, there's the face of Winston Churchill saying, "Let us go forward together," along with a few other wartime posters. And there's a lot of myth-making, as it were, about the sort of great figures of the war. How does the Regimental Museum discuss ideas about some of the perhaps more controversial leaders of the era?
We certainly always, as we take with any of our stories, take a balanced approach to how we look at understanding. We also, of course, look at how the individuals are seen, interpreted in history. We are very much here to tell the story of the Staffordshire Regiment and the Mercenary Regiment and its involvement in the Second World War. We try and create a balanced appeal to other aspects of it, and try and create an open dialogue about various individuals. Certainly some of those individuals inspired great heroic deeds and covered amazing activities in the course of the Second World War. But so we like to create a balanced approach, so we incorporate all views about people and their legacies. For instance, Churchill behind us, of course, as well as obviously reference to the Second World War, he was involved in the First World War, he was involved in the Boer War, so he's quite an interesting individual to personify that period,
really. Coming to parallel what one of my colleagues said about Churchill, there's also this thesis about the Second World War as the People's War, i.e. that it was won by the efforts of the ordinary people on the home front and the ordinary soldiers in the, well, wouldn't be trenches, more like foxholes and stuff like that. What do you think about the People's War thesis?
I think it's a very interesting thing. It's the story of how we won that war, and the story of anybody involved in that war is very much a people-centred story. We had boots on the ground, we had the people using the equipment. It was very much their contribution, their harnessing, which brought that war. But that, I wouldn't say I would treat the people being any different to the generals or the establishment above it. It's all contribution to the war effort was really important to be winning that war, and to make it as the best possible way that you can avoid making the least mistakes, and so win your war. So I think that is a very good thesis. It's very much a story of the people, and we'll work together on the home front and the war front. Everybody's work is vital. If we didn't have the ammunition, if we didn't have the railways working correctly, if we didn't have the food that we needed, the war would have been a much more different piece of work.
So here we are in the Anderson shelter, and I noticed that further back we had the community shelter, which has a lot of exhibits in it, but the Anderson shelter is also there. You don't mind me asking, while Anderson shelters are quite popular in the World War II narrative, why is it that we have the community shelter and the Anderson as well?
So if you were at work, if you're at school, if you're at a public place, or if you're out in the street, you would have run to communal shelter, which is what that represents. So you would have run to those on the streets. But if you were in your home, or sometimes actually in workplaces as well, Anderson shelters were deployed, and it's an important story of the home front, along with the Morrison shelter as well, which obviously played a vital role. The difference between the two being, as one can see behind us, this one is made of steel panels. You dug out a big hole and put your Anderson shelter inside it. The Morrison shelter was basically a reinforced table with cage around from the side, which should be noted where this wouldn't protect you from a direct hit, but it certainly protects you from shrapnel and other bits of damaged things flying around.
And perhaps more broadly, if you don't mind me asking, material history. How does the museum handle material artefacts and physical history in terms of its narrative to the Second World War?
So the museum has various objects, obviously can tell that story about the combat, both from a home front and from the military perspective. Obviously our collection reflects the history of the Staffordshire Regiment, that's its focus. So our uniforms, our equipment and those things all tell that story and that narrative. But outside we also collect things obviously tell that story on the home front as well, particularly related to the people of Staffordshire. So we collect material and things like that to help illustrate that story. And what's really important, I think, is for people to see objects and understand it, because sometimes you realise, even though this may have been 80, 90, 85 years ago, so when the start of the war, it is some of those objects actually are not too dissimilar from what we use now.
And one of the aspects of the Second World War a lot of people find interesting and is important is the role of technology and society's changing relationship to it, and in the military terms, the military's changing relationship with technology, and with new sorts of things, not just the incendiary bombs as we see in the poster, but also the sort of fact that war was brought to the people. How does the Regimental Museum portray and discuss these kind of ideas?
So technology development obviously is very much a story of war, and particularly the Second World War. So certainly within the museum we cover the different weapons, the different techniques that were developed across the war, and of course the knowledge that's gained according to the war about how to use that technology well in a way to make sure you achieve your war aims. We have a very limited space in museums to really go deep into various bits of technological development across the war, but of course they're built within our narratives that we explain within the museum. But technology-wise, of course, changes immensely over the course of the war, as you rightly say, the bomber offensives, which of course aircraft were around in the First World War, but they were used much differently in the Second World War, and also, of course, the development around aircraft. For instance, if we just take aircraft for example, changes from the piston to the jet over the course of that time period. Of course, and if we talk about weapons, there was the development of nuclear weapons, which really makes a massive difference, and obviously eventually brings about the end of the Second World War, probably with the defeat of Japan in August 1945. So technology is certainly a part of our narrative and how we explain the war, but also it is of course a story about proven technologies as well, and how they can make a big difference.
So with the Second World War, it's not just the fact that once again Britain and the other major powers brought their empires with them to the war, but also they often talk about how society changed as a result of the Second World War. As we can see with the pictures on the wall, new kinds of public awareness. That's about how one lives one's life in relation to everyone else. So I was wondering, how do we in a military-focused museum convey the way that the nation of Britain and indeed the world was changing in that time period?
Certainly within the narratives we have displayed in the museum, we talk about the changing nature of society, because the world that we have as a post-war world is a very different world from the world that came into that war. Certainly from a societal aspect, the war brought about a lot of changes, both in terms of how women were seen, how society worked, but the control of society, for instance, was evolved. Some of those attitudes that had been around pre 1930s also then came in the changed, but also maybe they lingered into the 50s and 60s. But certainly society was never the same again after the Second World War, and within the museum, so we have a lot of examples of human experience and how the things they've seen, the camaraderie that built up during that war, brought about massive changes in time period after that time.
So, when it comes to military history, it's often assumed to be, well, some use the term boys' history in that sense, even if the term actually has another meaning, but in the sense that it's not really much about, well, women, as it were. But as we can see here with the WVS canteen, do you feel that the museum's sort of trying to help depict the role of women more in military history, and how does the museum go about this?
It's a very good question. Yeah, unfortunately, what we lack a lot sometimes is archival and oral history that can actually tell that story from how women contributed to war. But when we're certainly within the Second World War and the First World War, there's well documented images, testimony, and all history talking about the experience of women in those conflicts. Of course, as we enter into the post Second World War world, there is lots of women involved in conflicts, and of course now women fight on the front line for all the British forces. As we go back actually in the past, we do have examples of women being involved in various conflicts. Certainly we had a lovely diorama here of them involved in the Napoleonic conflict from the Peninsular War. But yes, it's a difficult one to cover with the history, but we certainly are always very keen on just talking about that story, because as we were discussing earlier, women's contribution to that war was extremely important, extremely vital. If we're thinking about, here we're next to our WVS canteen. This was all part of the we deployed as part of the home front. On the home front, they were doing the work in the factories, running the trains, postal service, various things. The ATS were flying their aircraft here to the various airfields from factories. Vital work and things, and the war certainly wouldn't have been one without them.
And just to follow up in a little ancillary, what would you say to someone who feels like they would be interested in studying military history but aren't male, thus perhaps feel like they shouldn't be involved in the conversation? Do you have anything you'd like to say on that regard?
Everybody is willing to understand any form of history. It's military history, social history, any part of history, and military history is a story of people doing amazing things. It can be inspiring, male, female. It is really important to know, and there's individual stories here which can inspire all. And hopefully, particularly from a female perspective, more women get involved, we can actually get to understand some of those, more of those stories, and cover more of those stories of women's extraordinary work in conflict.
So, this being perhaps a bit of a more general thing, but as we're here in the stop lines that they built, I'm just wondering about your time at the Regimental Museum. How you feel about looking forward?
I've really enjoyed the time I've been at this wonderful museum, and we've got the stories that we tell, I think, are really important for people to keep learning and to keep understanding, because if we know about our history and heritage and the story of conflict, then hopefully we can learn from what we've learned in the past, and hopefully maybe go to change some of those things in the future. Being forearmed is better, I think, than approach it without foreknowledge, I think.
And thank you for your time as curator.
Pleasure.
Well, thank you to Peter for helping us understand the Second World War through the eyes of the regiment. And thank you again for your time helping bring out the story of the Staffordshire Regimental Museum. And whether you're a World War II buff or not, wherever you are in the world, it was lovely having you here.